Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 16. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come up with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began on the 24th of February 2022, I received many questions concerning the war. Many of these questions deal with eschatological matters. But there are also other questions. Here is a frequently asked question. How should Christians pray? Christians are confused because there are many opinions and perspectives concerning the war. Before the war, Ukraine was hardly known, and it was not on the radar of most people. Overnight, everyone becomes an expert, weighing in on the issue without giving much thought to it. Often, views are expressed with raw passion. The unfortunate result of such unmitigated emotions is the fraying of relationships. Take a step back, and you will notice that most of our opinions are influenced by the media we consume, which is predominantly Western, American, and Western European. As such, there is an inbuilt inherent bias, for good or bad. Russia is often painted as the bad actor in the world stage of geopolitics. Even in Hollywood movies, Russians are often the bad guys. Before anyone gets the wrong idea that I'm pro-Putin and I support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, let me state categorically that I support neither side. Geopolitics are complex. Nations and alliances of nations have their own interests to advance and protect. There are hidden agendas. Motives are often concealed and not obvious to the general public. What people on the streets see and hear are mostly slanted news and spun information. If it is not outright propaganda, truth usually lies buried in the layers beneath. So, we must be both objective and discerning. For me, I try to be dispassionate in my analysis and rely on the Holy Spirit for wisdom and discernment. There is no good political actor in this conflict. All the political leaders have their own agendas and ambitions. Russia is likely to be one of the countries, which includes Iran and Turkey, that will invade Israel as prophesied by Ezekiel. For the first time in history, we observe the geopolitical chess pieces described by the prophet being set in place. That puts President Putin and the political leadership of Russia in direct conflict with God and His chosen nation, Israel. As for the West, this is where the one world government and Antichrist are going to emerge, as prophesied in the Bible. The signs are getting increasingly obvious. The global elites in the West are tightening their control over the powerful international financial and banking systems through a slew of highly questionable measures, such as the climate change agenda and ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics. These are attempts to control the nations through the Great Reset. The goal is to bring about a new world order. Russia and China are openly resisting this emerging new world order arrangement. Several other countries are also doing the same, albeit more cautiously. It might not be immediately obvious to many people, but this is a primary reason for the war. For more than 2 decades, the West has been expanding the NATO the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance into Eastern Europe. This is clearly an act of provocation, which Russia had warned repeatedly it would retaliate. I say all that to highlight the complexity of the issue. Therefore, Christians must be careful not to take sides, and worse, pray outside of God's will. None of these political leaders is good in the sight of God. Every one of them is guilty of selfish ambitions to amass more power and control. That is the reason Jesus will be coming back to destroy all human empires and establish God's kingdom on earth. If you want to pray concerning this crisis, pray for the ordinary Ukrainians and Ukrainian Christians. They are suffering because of the war. But please, do not forget to pray also for the ordinary Russians and the Russian believers. They are also suffering due to Western banking and economic sanctions against Russia. I will urge Christians to refrain from praying against Putin and Russia. I know that some American pastors and Christian publications and ministries are urging believers to pray imprecatory prayer against them. An imprecatory prayer is a prayer that calls down curses and judgments on the enemies. There are quite a few imprecatory psalms in the Bible. Most of them are composed by King David. We can understand the reason. David often engaged in wars against both Israel's enemies and his political enemies. He needed God's help to intervene and fight against his enemies. There is a place for imprecatory prayer, but not in this case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let me explain. In a nutshell, the invasion could be a divine judgment against Ukraine. In the Bible, some wars are divine judgments. God also decreed invasions to displaced nations when their sins had reached a certain threshold. We notice in the Old Testament that Israel's peace and prosperity were closely linked to their obedience to the Lord. When the Israelites sinned persistently against God, He would allow their enemies to attack and even dominate them as a punishment. In Genesis chapter 15, God had a fascinating conversation with Abraham. He promised Abraham multitudes of descendants, and that his descendants would take possession of the land of Canaan. However, that would happen only 400 years later. The reason for the 400-year delay is fascinating. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, God could not remove the Amorites from the land because their sin had not reached the full measure. God is the creator, and all the earth belongs to Him. So, He has the right to give any piece of land to whomever He chooses. However, He would not displace a nation arbitrarily without valid reasons. He would remove a nation from its land only when its iniquity is ripe for judgment. We see this principle in action in Deuteronomy chapter 2. Here in this chapter, Moses recounted his conversation with the Lord concerning taking possession of the promised land. The Lord told Moses that He was not giving the Israelites the land of the Moabites because He had given it to them for a possession. Then God gave Moses a history lesson. Previously, the Moabite dispossessed the land from the Emim. The Emim were giants. God also told Moses not to harass the Ammonites because He had given the land to them for a possession. Previously, the land was occupied by the Zamzummim, which was another giant tribe. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and He dispossessed them and settled in their place, as He did for the people of Esau. the Moabites. From extra-biblical historical background studies, the giant tribes were known to be notoriously wicked. We can surmise that God destroyed them and removed them from their lands because their sins had reached the full measure. In both cases, it was the Lord who destroyed these giant tribes, but the Lord did it through the Moabites and Ammonites. As for the Israelites, God commanded them to take possession of Canaan, beginning with the lands of the Amorites. The Amorites were also giants. 400 years had passed. The sin of the Amorites was ripe for judgment. When you read Deuteronomy chapter 2, you will notice the term dispossess is used repeatedly to describe the elimination of the giant tribes from their lands. And the term possession is used to describe taking ownership of the lands. Both these terms imply war and invasion. Bear in mind that God was behind these wars and invasions. God uses wars and invasions as means of divine judgment. I know it is hard for some Christians to stomach this gory truth, but it is a biblical principle. God is fair. His chosen people were subjected to the same means of judgment when their sins reached full measure. God used the Assyrians to dispossess Israel and the Babylonians to dispossess Judah. Can we apply this biblical principle of wars and invasions as divine judgment on the situation in Ukraine? The answer is yes. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. In 2012, Ernst & Young ranked Ukraine among the 3 most corrupt countries in the world. In 2018, Transparency International named Ukraine to be the most corrupt country in Europe after Russia. Where there is widespread corruption in the country, there will be injustice and its citizens will suffer. The country is also a center for international money laundering and human trafficking. Before World War II, the worst persecution and killing of the Jews happened in Ukraine. In the event known as Babi Yar in 1941, 34,000 Jews were massacred in 2 days. While the Nazis organized the murder, the Ukrainians did the killing. Today, neo-Nazi groups continue to operate freely in the country. These groups trace their roots back to Hitler's time. God will not hold a nation guiltless for touching the apple of his eye. So, the Russian invasion of Ukraine might be God's judgment on the country for its wickedness in the past and present. I'm not saying that it is, but the likelihood is not low. If the invasion is God's judgment, you do not want to pray against it. If you do so, you are praying against the will of God. No Christians should do that. If Russia's invasion of Ukraine is God's will, then President Putin and Russia are God's instruments of judgment against Ukraine. Some of you might argue that Russia is no better than Ukraine, if not worse. Earlier, I mentioned that Ukraine was ranked the most corrupt country in Europe after Russia in 2018. So, doesn't that make Russia more wicked? That was exactly Habakkuk's argument. The prophet made 2 complaints to God. First, he complained of the violence and injustice in Judah. The Lord responded, telling him that he was going to judge his country. He would bring the Chaldeans to invade Judah. God's answer stunned and confused Habakkuk. He complained again, and this is my paraphrase. Lord, how could you use a nation more wicked than us as an instrument of your judgment? The Lord answered that he would judge the Babylonians in due time. God's ways are beyond us. We just have to recognize that this is how He works. All we need to know is God is righteous and just. The wicked will be punished in due time. Well, some Christians will still argue war is bad and invasion is wrong, even if it is provoked. Putin and Russia are the aggressors. Therefore, it is only right to pray against them. I'm afraid that is a theologically flawed argument. Isn't God the one who enabled the Moabites and Ammonites to dispossess, to invade the lands of Emin and Zemzumin? Isn't God the one who commanded Israel to dispossess, to invade the Canaanite tribes and take possession of their lands? Bear in mind that Israel was the aggressor in each of these invasions, and Israel attacked without being provoked. This is an inconvenient truth in the Bible. For the longest time, theologians and ordinary Christians grapple with these unprovoked invasions in the Old Testament accounts. The struggle arises from a failure to see God as a judge. God judges the wicked, and wars and invasions are two of His means of judgment. So, you cannot argue that the invader is always wrong and bad. If you insist on that line of argument, then you must also say the same about God. These are my objections to imprecatory prayers against Putin and Russia. There is a strong possibility that they are God's instruments of judgment against Ukraine. Nations and individuals judge the war according to their self-interest and different perspectives. For Christians, we must judge a war using biblical principles and perspective. War is ugly. The Ukrainians are suffering. It is unfortunate, but that does not excuse Christians from praying according to God's will. So, how do we pray? Pray for the ordinary Ukrainians. Pray for the ordinary Russians too. Pray for the Christians in both countries. Pray that God will have mercy on them during judgment. Pray for God's will to be done.